The world had a fever. For centuries, the patient had endured the infection, the seeping black poison of industry. The scarred landscapes gouged by mines, the great plastic gyres spinning in our oceans like tumors. The sky, once a clean canvas for the sun and moon, is now a stained ceiling of perpetual twilight. Thick with the exhaust of a billion engines and the acrid smoke from forests burned for pasture, cities sprawled like metallic fungus, their electric lights a false, frantic constellation against the true forgotten stars. Humanity in its frantic consuming billions was the pathogen, and the Earth's vital signs were crashing. From the deepest oceanic trenches to the highest, thinnest air, the planet groaned under the weight. The core itself seemed to pulse with a pained, rhythmic heat. This was not a passive dying. This was an active sickness, a global sepsis. The ice caps wept, not in sorrow, but as a body sweats to break a terrible, consuming fever. The storms that lashed the coasts were not random acts of weather, but the planet tossing in its bed, trying to shake off the pestilence. The Earth was sick, sick unto death, and any living body, when pushed to the brink, will muster its defenses. Its immune system had always been its predators, the great balancers of the natural order. But for this specific, clever, and prolific infection, a special cure was required. Deep in forgotten places beneath the permafrost that was no longer permanent. Within mountains that had watched empires rise and fall, sealed in tombs older than written language, something stirred. It was a latent code, a final, terrible antibody programmed into the very bedrock of existence. The fever was peaking and the host was about to fight back. The cure for humanity was to be a 3-part nightmare, and the prescription was death on a scale never before imagined. The end of days was not an extinction. It was a triage. The groaning of the planet did not subside. It intensified, shifting from a pained moan to a focused, resonant hum that vibrated through the very bones of the world. This was no longer the aimless thrashing of a feverish patient. This was the deliberate, terrifying mobilization of an immune system, deep within the Earth's molten heart. The ancient and slumbering consciousness, known to forgotten myths as Gaia, began its counter-assault. The response was not a single event, but a synchronized global emergence. In the radioactive ruins of Chernobyl, the Earth split open not with magma, but with a chilling spectral light that reanimated the long dead, their forms twisting into shambling, ravenous things. From the deepest, lightless caves of the Carpathian Mountains, where the air had been still for millennia, a bitter cold flowed forth, carrying with it ancient, aristocratic shapes that moved with a predator's grace and a bottomless thirst. In the old-growth forests of the Pacific Northwest, where the trees themselves remembered a time before man, the shadows beneath the canopies coalesced, birthing monstrous, fur-clad forms whose howls spoke of a primal, territorial fury. These were not random monsters. They were a targeted, tripartite antibody, each strain engineered for a specific function in the cleansing of the human pathogen. The Earth was deploying its ultimate predators. It's a zombie, a relentless consuming plague that would break the cities and devour the masses. It's a vampire, a precise predatory scourge that would call the strong and the clever from the shadows. The werewolf, a feral territorial force that would reclaim the wilds and crush any who sought refuge there. The first signs were subtle, dismissed as hysteria or mass psychosis. A news report from a Tokyo subway about commuters turning on each other with mindless bites. A story from a remote Romanian village where every inhabitant was found exsanguinated, 2 punctures in their necks. A gruesome account from a Canadian logging camp, where men were torn apart by what was described as bears of impossible size and cunning. But these isolated incidents were mere symptoms of the infection taking hold. The planet had diagnosed its sickness, and the cure was now coursing through its veins. A 3-part nightmare preparing to be unleashed upon a world that never saw its true enemy itself. The fever was breaking, and the sweat that would cover the earth was to be one of blood. The subtle, isolated incidents were no longer deniable. They were a contagion of violence, spreading faster than any news report. The planet's immune system had identified the host cells, and the antibodies were now swarming. The leashes, held for eons in the fist of the earth, were dropped. It began with the dead. In overcrowded cemeteries from Manila to Mumbai, the soil churned as grasping, gray-skinned hands clawed their way to the surface. They were not the slow, shambling fools of fiction. These were plague-born, their movements a jerky, insect-like scramble, driven by a single, overwhelming imperative to consume the warm and the living. A morgue attendant in Berlin became the first course for a dozen of his former charges, his screams muffled by the relentless, wet chewing of a horde that felt no fear, no pain, only hunger. They spilled into the streets, a tidal wave of rotting flesh, and where they passed, they left behind not corpses, but new recruits for their mindless legion. From the high, shadowed arches of forgotten cathedrals and the penthouse suites of abandoned skyscrapers, the vampires observed the chaos below. With a silence that was more terrifying than any sound, they descended. They moved like liquid darkness, their forms blurring through the panicked crowds. A woman fleeing the undead would suddenly be yanked into an alley, her choked gasp cut short as a pale, aristocratic figure drank deeply, then let her lifeless body fall to be trampled. They were precision killers, culling the herd with an efficiency that was both beautiful and horrifying. They did not feed from desperation, but from a place of ancient, predatory right, their eyes gleaming with cold intellect as they watched the human world burn. And in the sprawling national parks and the concrete jungles of suburbia, the werewolves answered the call of a wild, resurgent earth. The crunch of a family sedan's roof under a massive, fork-covered paw was the first and last warning for those who had encroached upon the old territories. They were fury incarnate, a storm of muscle, claw, and fang. A father trying to defend his home with a baseball bat was disemboweled with a single casual swipe, his dying sight the gleam of primal amber eyes. Their howls were not just sounds. They were a physical force, a vibration that promised a return to a savage, unforgiving world where humanity was no longer at the top of the food chain. The leashes were off. The three-part nightmare was loose, and the world dissolved into a symphony of screams, howls, and the endless, mindless moaning of the dead. The great culling had begun. Panic was no longer a reaction. It was the atmosphere, a thick, suffocating smog of terror that choked the last vestiges of order from the world. The initial, isolated attacks had been a warning tremor. Now, the full seismic shock of the nightmare hit, and humanity began to die in waves. Cities became slaughterhouses on an unimaginable scale. The zombie hordes, grown to biblical proportions, functioned as a single, mindless organism of consumption. They poured through streets like a river of rotting flesh, their collective moan a dirge for civilization. Windows shattered under the weight of their bodies. Barricades of cars and furniture were swallowed whole, the desperate people behind them pulled down into a frenzy of tearing hands and gnashing teeth. The air grew thick with the coppery stench of blood and the sweet, foul odor of opened intestines. What the zombies did not eat, they simply trampled into a paste of bone and viscera. Above the carnage, the vampires conducted their symphony of death from the rooftops. They watched the chaos with cold, calculating eyes, picking their moments to strike. A child, separated from its parents, would be swept into the sky by a dark shape, its brief, piercing scream ending abruptly. A group of survivors holding a fortified line would find themselves attacked from behind as vampires materialized from the shadows, moving too fast for the human eye to follow. They killed with an elegant, brutal efficiency. Necks snapped, arteries opened with surgical precision. They did not just feed, they curated the dying, taking the strongest blood and leaving the rest for the shambling masses below. The streets ran red, and the vampires drank their fill. And from the crumbling edges of the urban sprawl, the werewolves came. They did not hunt in disorganized packs, but with a terrifying tactical savagery. They targeted the fleeing, the ones who thought the open roads were safe. A convoy of refugees would find its lead vehicle smashed sideways by a monstrous fur-covered form, halting the exodus. Then the real butchery began. The werewolves were engines of destruction, ripping through metal and flesh with equal ease. Their howls echoed over the screams, a sound of pure, untamed nature reclaiming its dominion. They left behind not just corpses, but ruins vehicles torn open like tin cans, bodies rendered unrecognizable. This was the great culling. It was not a war, for war implies two sides. This was a harvest. Humanity was the crop, and the Earth's new predators were the reapers. working in a terrible, unspoken tandem to thin the herd. The skies, once stained with pollution, were now stained with smoke and the flight of dark wings. The earth, once scarred by concrete, was now fertilized with blood. The age of man was ending, not with a whimper, but with a chorus of screams, howls, and the relentless, hungry moans of the dead. From the ashes of panic, a fragile, desperate resolve coalesced. The scattered remnants of humanity's militaries regrouped, forging a final, unified front. They stood in the ruins of a once great city, a bristling line of steel, fossil fuel, and human defiance. Tanks formed a metallic wall, their barrels aimed down avenues choked with rubble. Between them, soldiers in scarred body armor stood firm, their fingers tight on triggers, their faces set in grim masks. This was to be the line in the sand, the moment the tide of monsters broke against the unyielding rock of human ingenuity. The first wave to hit them was the gray tide of the dead. The order to fire was a thunderous roar that split the sky. Heavy machine guns hosed the shambling ranks, stitching lines of carnage through the horde. Artillery shells rained down, erupting in blossoms of fire, and dismembered bodies that painted the ruins black. For a few fleeting moments, it seemed to work. The zombies fell in heaps, their advance slowing. A ragged cheer went up from the human lines, a brief, beautiful illusion of victory. It did not last. The zombies did not break. They simply piled. Their fallen formed grisly ramps over which the next wave climbed. They were a force of physics, not morale, and their numbers were endless. Then, the true horror began. From the skeletal high-rises flanking the position, dark shapes rained down. Vampires landed amidst the artillery crews with the silence of falling shadows. They moved through the emplacements like scythes through wheat, severing heads and tearing out throats before a single defensive shot could be fired. The great guns fell silent one by one, their crews reduced to twitching heaps. Simultaneously, the armored line buckled from within. A monstrous, fur-covered shape erupted from a manhole directly beneath the main battle tank. The werewolf's claws, capable of shredding armor plate, peeled the hatch open like a tin can. The screams from inside were short-lived. All along the line, vehicles were ambushed, flipped, and torn apart by beasts that used the urban jungle as their hunting ground. The soldiers, trained to fight a visible enemy, were being exterminated by predators that refused to face their front. The front did not retreat, it vanished. The orderly line dissolved into 100 isolated pockets of screaming, dying men, once filled with the empowering roar of engines and gunfire. Was now filled with the wet sounds of tearing meat and the crunch of bone. The monsters were not just attacking humanity, they were dismantling its very concept of warfare. The last great army of humankind was not defeated in a battle, was consumed, its steel skeleton picked clean by the three jaws of the nightmare. The vanishing front proved a terrible truth. Against the Earth's immune system, humanity's greatest weapons were nothing but toys. With conventional armies reduced to bloodstains and memories, humanity's final hope flickered in the shadows. They were the ghosts, the clandestine orders that had hunted the supernatural for centuries. Armed not with artillery, but with esoteric knowledge and unwavering conviction. The Brotherhood of the Silver Cross, the Sons of the First Flame, and other secret cabals emerged from their hidden chapters, believing this was the prophesied war they were born to fight. Their initial strikes were devastatingly effective, a brief, brilliant flare of hope in the overwhelming darkness. A pack of werewolves cornered in a moonlit scrapyard was incinerated by blessed phosphor and silver shrapnel grenades. Their triumphant howls turned to agonized yelps as their supernatural flesh melted from their bones. In the catacombs beneath Paris, a nest of vampires was caught in their diurnal slumber. The hunters moved with silent precision, driving oak stakes into still hearts, and beheading the ancient fiends before they could awaken. Their centuries of cunning undone in a moment of holy violence. But the Earth's antibodies were adaptive. The hunters were still human, and they were fighting a force of nature. The vampires, masters of intelligence and deception, turned the hunters' own methods against them. A safe house of the Sons of the First Flame was betrayed by one of their own, his mind ensnared by a vampire's hypnotic gaze. The hunters were waiting for a report. They received a slaughter. The vampires descended upon them not as monsters, but as silent, invisible death, moving through their sanctum like smoke, leaving behind a gallery of exsanguinated corpses. The werewolves, possessing a feral cunning, refused to be baited into traps. They became the trappers. A team of Brotherhood hunters, tracking a lone beast into a derelict factory, found themselves surrounded. The lone wolf had been the lure. From the rusted rafters and shattered windows, the rest of the pack descended. It was not a hunt, it was an extermination. The clash was a brutal melee of flashing claws against swinging silver, but for every werewolf that fell with a cry of pain. 3 hunters were ripped limb from limb, their sanctified weapons trampled into the grime. The ghosts had fought the darkness their whole lives, but they had never faced a darkness that was the will of the world itself. Their knowledge was a flickering candle against an apocalyptic storm. One by one, their sanctums fell silent. Their last desperate broadcasts were a litany of screams, snarls, and the chilling sound of breaking bones. The final hunt was over. The ghosts had joined the ranks of the dead, and with their passing, the last light of human resistance was extinguished. The planet was now truly belongs to the 3 factions of the nightmare, and their fragile alliance was about to shatter. With the last of the human hunters eradicated, a tense and bloody silence fell over the world. It was not a peace, but the quiet of a battlefield after the initial assault, the calm before the storm of succession. The shared purpose that had loosely united the 3 factions, the culling of humanity, was achieved. Now, with the prize of a broken world before them, the ancient inherent animosities between predator, parasite, and plague erupted into the open. The first clashes were territorial, a testing of boundaries drawn in blood. A pack of werewolves, having claimed the concrete canyons of a financial district as their new hunting grounds, found their territory violated not by the living, but by the endless, mindless hunger of the zombie horde. The beasts tore through the shambling ranks with feral glee, reducing bodies to pulp, but for every dozen they destroyed, 100 more lurched from the side streets. The werewolf's strength was meaningless against an enemy that felt no pain and knew no fear. An enemy that would simply stand back up unless rendered to unidentifiable gore. The vampires, observing from their high perches, saw this not as a threat but as an opportunity. They began a campaign of precise, cruel extermination. A werewolf alpha, drinking from a rainwater gutter, would be struck by a crossbow bolt carved from its own packmate's bone, fired from a shadowed window a quarter-mile away. The vampires targeted the leaders, the strong, seeking to decapitate the packs and leave them disorganized. But the vampires' arrogance was their vulnerability, their sanctums, chosen for seclusion and defensibility, were of little interest to the zombies, who were drawn to the lingering scent of life and warmth. Yet a single zombie, stumbling into a crypt, could be a catalyst for disaster. A vampire rising to dispose of the nuisance would find its ankle seized by rotting fingers. A bite, harmless to an immortal, would not kill, but the mere act of contact, the defilement by such a lowly creature, was an insult that sparked a cold, furious rage. The world became a shifting 3-way battleground. The zombies were the sea, slow, inexorable, and drowning all in their path. The werewolves were the storm, all fury and raw power, crashing against the shores. The vampires were the rocks, ancient, hard, and unmovable, being worn down by the endless, mindless waves. Alliances were fleeting, forged in the moment against a common foe, and broken just as quickly. The schism was complete. The war for the future had begun, and the only rule was that there were none. In the brutal calculus of the New World, the zombie horde possessed a single, overwhelming variable: infinity. While the vampires schemed and the werewolves raged, the dead simply multiplied. They were the gray tide, a patient, mindless force of erosion, and they began to win the war. Their strategy was not one of intent, but of sheer, suffocating mass. A werewolf pack, no matter how fierce, could only kill so many before its members were physically exhausted, their muscles screaming, their claws blunted on bone and rotting flesh. The zombies felt no fatigue. They would press forward over the dismembered bodies of their own, a ceaseless wave of grasping hands and snapping teeth. A mighty alpha, having slain 100, would find its hind legs seized, then another and another. The weight of a dozen corpses would bear it down, and the tide would wash over it. The forest would fall silent, save for the wet, rending sounds. And when the horde moved on, only a red stain and a few tufts of bloody fur remained. The vampires, from their spires, watched their hunting grounds vanish beneath the gray swell. Their greatest strength, their speed and stealth, was useless against an enemy that had no central nervous system to paralyze with fear. No heart to stop with a well-placed strike. A vampire could decapitate a dozen zombies in the blink of an eye, only to have the 13th lurch forward and latch onto its arm. While the bite itself was not lethal, the contact was a profound defilement. The sheer, mindless persistence of the horde was an insult to their ancient, ordered cruelty. They were forced to abandon their nests, their libraries, their ancient haunts, retreating higher and higher as the rotting sea level rose. The Grey Tide was not an army. It was a geological event. It did not attack cities. It consumed them, filling streets to the rooftacks with a squirming, moaning mass of flesh. It did not defeat its enemies. It buried them. The dynamic of the nightmare shifted. The fierce rivalry between Fang and Claw was forgotten, replaced by a dawning, chilling realization. They were no longer the apex predators. They were merely the next course. The plague was inheriting the earth, and its currency was endless, rotting numbers. The Grey Tide demanded a new calculus. In the face of infinite, mindless consumption, the ancient enmity between wolf and vampire seemed a petty luxury. Survival, the most primal of all instincts, forced a parley, the ruins of a grand observatory high above the stench and moans of the horde. The lords of the two remaining intelligent factions met. Kalen, the werewolf lord, was a mountain of scarred muscle and simmering fury, his amber eyes burning with the promise of violence. Lord Valerius, the vampire sovereign, was his opposite, a figure of pale, gaunt elegance, his ageless face a mask of cold intellect. For a long moment, the only sound was the growl rumbling in Kellen's chest and the whisper of Valerius's ancient robes. There were no oaths sworn, no hands shaken. There was only a shared, grim understanding, sealed not in trust, but in mutual necessity. The pact of Fang and Claw was born of desperation, a temporary armistice in the war for the world. Their strategy was a brutal symphony of their combined strengths. The werewolves became the anvil. With thunderous howls that shook the very foundations of the dead cities, Kellen's packs launched themselves at the flanks of the great zombie hordes. They were a whirlwind of destruction, not to kill, but to herd. They tore through the ranks, creating channels of carnage, funneling the mindless masses into predetermined killing zones, wide boulevards, sprawling plazas, the skeletal remains of industrial parks. Then came the hammer, guided by the vampire's cold mind. From the rooftops, vampire assassins, armed with long, silent blades, pinpointed the shambling. Pulsating nexus walkers, the rare, mutated zombies that emitted a psychic signal coordinating the horde. One by one, these grotesque conductors were beheaded, their collapse sending ripples of confusion through the ranks around them. But the true masterpiece of their plan was fire. The vampires, with their knowledge of forgotten chemistry and human infrastructure, located the fuel depots, the gas mains, the chemical silos. As the werewolves lured the densest concentrations of the horde over these subterranean rivers of fuel, Valerius's kin triggered the cataclysm. The earth itself erupted. Firestorms, fueled by Promethean delight and strategic genius, boiled up from the sewers and exploded from the buildings. The zombies, packed together like cordwood, became a single, continent-sized pyre. The stench of burned rot choked the world. The endless moaning was drowned out by the roar of the flames, and the triumphant, savage howls of the werewolves as they retreated from the inferno. For the first time, the Grey Tide was not just being slowed, it was being systematically, ruthlessly exterminated. The pact of Fang and Claw was a terrifying success, proving that intelligence, however cruel, could triumph over mindless numbers. But as the last embers died amid the mountains of charred flesh, Kalen and Valerius locked eyes once more. The common enemy was nearly vanquished. The pact had served its purpose. The werewolf's eyes held no gratitude, only the promise of a war yet to come. The coordinated assault against the zombies was no longer a battle. It was a systematic cleansing. The pact of Fang and Claw evolved into a perfectly tuned engine of extermination, its methods growing more refined and merciless with each engagement. The mindless horde, which had once seemed an unstoppable force of nature, was now being outmaneuvered, outhought, and utterly erased. The vampires, with their aerial vantage and preternatural senses, became the architects of the purge. They identified the remaining Nexus Walkers, the pulsing, tumorous brains of the operation, and marked them for death. Silhouetted against the bloody moon, vampire assassins would dive, their movements a blur, their silvered blades severing the vital neural cords that bound the shambling legions. With each Nexus Walker that fell, a swath of the horde would stumble into disarray, becoming a stagnant milling pool of flesh, ripe for the slaughter. It was then that the werewolves were unleashed. Kellen's packs, no longer needing to herd, were free to indulge their most savage instincts. They crashed into the disoriented zombie masses like living avalanches. This was not the strategic carnage of before, this was a frenzy. They tore through the rotting ranks, not merely breaking bones, but pulverizing them, reducing bodies to a foul slurry under their pounding paws. The air grew thick with the mist of decay and fresh blood as the werewolves painted the ruins in broad, violent strokes of gore. Their howls were no longer signals, but songs of pure, unadulterated release. The final act of the purge was one of absolute finality. Luring the last great concentration of the horde into the vast concrete basin of a dried-out reservoir, the vampires triggered their masterpiece. With a series of controlled explosions, they collapsed the surrounding structures, burying millions under megatons of rubble and steel. Then, they ignited the pockets of methane that had built up from the mass decay. The geyser of fire that erupted lit the night sky for 100 miles, a funeral pyre on a continental scale. The moaning of the dead was finally, utterly silenced, replaced by the crackle of flames and the sizzle of cooking meat. The rotting horde was purged. The plague was over. As the sun rose on a world scoured clean of the mindless dead, it rose on a new landscape. The ruins were quiet, stained with ash and blood. And standing atop the victory, drenched in the gore of their mutual foe, the vampire Lord Valerius and the werewolf Lord Kalen surveyed their prize. The pact had held. But now, with no common enemy left to fight, the silence between them was more threatening than any moan or howl. The world was theirs to claim, and there were now only two claimants. The silence after the purge was a fragile, venomous thing. For 3 days, a tense truce held as the allies licked their wounds and counted their dead. The werewolves, their feral blood still singing with the thrill of the hunt, grew restless in the quiet. The vampires, their cold minds ever calculating, saw the future with stark clarity. A world shared was a world divided. The pact of Fang and Claw had been a necessity. Its dissolution was an inevitability. Kalen, the werewolf lord, stood on a high peak, the rising sun painting his fur the color of fresh blood. Below, his pack slept among the ruins, exhausted and sated. He saw a world ripe for the taking, a new wilderness where the strong would rule as nature intended. He never saw the betrayal coming from the one who had stood beside him. Lord Valerius had not slept. He had planned. He knew a direct assault on the rested werewolves would be catastrophic. Instead, he offered a tribute, a gesture of goodwill to celebrate their victory. Great casks of wine, looted from the cellars of a dead world, spiked not with poison, but with potent sedatives derived from toxic flora, known to vampires but lethal to most others. The werewolves, their guards lowered in victory, drank deeply. The rich liquid, a poor substitute for blood, but a welcome indulgence. As the first light of dawn broke, the drug took hold. The mighty beasts did not fall dead. They collapsed into a deep, unnatural slumber, their powerful bodies betraying them. Their guttural snores were the only sounds in the camp. Then Valerius gave the signal. From the shadows, his vampires emerged. They did not fight, they executed. It was a slaughter of unparalleled efficiency. Silver daggers held in pale, steady hands were driven into the hearts of the sleeping giants. Jagged obsidian blades sawed through thick necks, severing heads from bodies. There was no glorious battle, no final defiant stand. There was only the wet, choking sounds of a massacre, the coppery stench of blood flooding the air. And the terrible silence of the werewolves who never woke to defend themselves? Kalen, his own system, fighting the toxin due to his immense size, awoke to the scent of his people's death. He roared, a sound of pure, shattered agony that shook the very stones, and surged to his feet. But it was too late. He stood as a king amidst the corpse of his nation, his own body sluggish, his vision blurred. The blood-drenched dawn had arrived, and it belonged not to the fang and claw, but to the cunning and the cold. The war was over before the first conscious blow was struck. Kellen's roar of betrayal echoed across the silent, corpse-strewn plain. Though the sedative still clung to his limbs like lead, his rage was a fire that burned through the poison. He was a whirlwind of grief and fury, and the first vampires to reach him were not slain, but unmade. He did not simply kill, he erased them, his claws reducing them to bloody mist and shattered bone. He was a force of nature, and for a moment it seemed he might single-handedly reclaim the dawn. But Lord Valerius had not orchestrated this betrayal without a final, definitive countermeasure. He had not spent the quiet days merely planning the massacre. He had been searching, scouring the ruins of humanity's oldest and most esoteric libraries. His prize was the obsidian tear, a legendary artifact said to hold the power of purification, capable of scouring corruption from any living thing. To a vampire, it was a useless trinket. To a werewolf, it was the ultimate weapon. As Kalen charged, his massive form tearing a path of destruction through the vampire ranks, Valerius stood his ground. He did not raise a weapon. He raised the tear, a small black gem that seemed to drink the morning light. As Kalen leaped, a final killing arc of claws aimed to decapitate the vampire lord, Valerius channeled his ancient will into the artifact. A wave of blinding white energy erupted from the gem. It did not burn, it washed. It passed over Kalen, and where it touched, the monstrous form began to dissolve. The thick, powerful fur receded into pale human skin. The crushing jaws snapped back into the shape of a man's face. The towering, terrifying beast collapsed onto the bloody ground, replaced by a naked, bewildered, and utterly broken man. The mighty Alpha was gone. Only Kalen, a human, remained, shivering on the cold earth, surrounded by the butchered remains of his people. Valerius looked down at his defeated foe, his expression one of cold academic interest. The Crimson Lord's gambit was complete. He had not just defeated the werewolves, or had rendered their very nature obsolete. He had turned their greatest strength into their ultimate vulnerability. The war was over. The age of the wolf had ended not with a bang, but with a whimper of human despair. The blinding white light of the obsidian tear did not fade, it had spread. From his vantage point, Lord Valerius directed the artifact's purifying energy, not just at the broken form of Kalen, but out across the continent. A wave of silent cleansing power washed over the world, seeking the taint of the lycanthropic curse. Wherever it touched, the monstrous was scoured away, leaving only the mortal in its wake. In the forests, a pack that had been cornering a terrified group of surviving humans suddenly faltered. Their savage howls of triumph choked off into cries of human confusion as their powerful bodies shrank, their fur retreating, their claws softening into harmless nails. They stood naked and vulnerable, staring at their own human hands as the very humans they had been hunting stared back, first in terror, then in dawning, vengeful understanding. In the ruins of cities, werewolves mid-lep fell from the sky as humans, their bones breaking against the concrete from a height that would have been nothing to the beast. The fierce amber light in their eyes was extinguished, replaced by the wide, fearful pupils of men and women who had just awoken from a terrible dream to find themselves in a worse reality. The balance of power held for so long by tooth and claw evaporated in an instant. The surviving vampires descended upon them not as equals in a war, but as farmers, harvesting a blighted crop. It was not a battle, it was a culling. The former werewolves, disoriented and weak, were systematically hunted down. There were no glorious last stands. There were only desperate, futile attempts to flee, ended by the swift, cold grace of a vampire strike. The air, which had so often echoed with their triumphant howls, was now filled with the pathetic whimpers of dying humans, the final, shameful sound of a broken species. Kalen, forced to his knees before Valerius, witnessed it all. The last thing he saw before a vampire's blade took his head was the cold, satisfied gaze of the victor. The howl of the werewolf people was silenced forever, its last note a whimper of absolute defeat. The world now had a single, undisputed master. With the werewolves cured and slaughtered, and the zombies a memory of ash, an eerie quiet fell over the world. Lord Valerius and his vampiric kin stood unchallenged. They perched in the silent skyscrapers like gods on obsidian thrones, their crimson eyes scanning a planet they owned utterly. But a terrible realization, cold and inevitable, began to dawn in their ancient minds. The silence was not peace, it was starvation. The great culling had been too effective. The herds of humanity were nearly extinct. Frantic, adrenaline-rich blood that had flowed so freely during the panic was gone. What remained were scattered, feral pockets of survivors, their blood thin and tainted by fear and malnutrition. A vampire who fed on such wretchedness gained little sustenance and no pleasure. The victory was turning to dust in their mouths. They had won the world, only to find it a larder, rapidly emptying towards a final, eternal famine. A new edict was passed from the Crimson Lord himself, a decree born of desperate pragmatism rather than mercy. The remaining humans were not to be exterminated. They were to be gathered, preserved, cultivated. The vampires became sinister shepherds. Using their speed and hypnotic powers, they rounded up the last dregs of humanity, herding them into fortified enclaves, former prisons, stadiums, and underground facilities. These were not places of torture, but of controlled existence. The humans were fed, watered, and kept in a state of docile, ignorant health. They were shielded from the elements, from disease, and from any hope of freedom. Their world shrank to the confines of their pens, their lives reduced to a simple, brutal purpose: to be living blood banks. The harvest began. It was a quiet, orderly, and deeply macabre process. Vampiric overseers would move through the enclaves, selecting individuals with the robust health and rich blood. The taking was clinical, not cruel. A swift, painless bite, a measured draw of vital fluid, then release back into the herd to recover and regenerate. There were no more screams of terror, only the dull, compliant eyes of cattle. The vampires had not just conquered humanity, they had domesticated it. The world entered a new, stable, and horrifying equilibrium. The predators ensured the survival of their prey, not out of compassion, but to ensure the survival of their own eternal reign. The planet was green and quiet again, its fever broken, its immune system resting, its new masters ruling from the shadows, forever sustained by the carefully managed herd. Centuries flowed like a slow, dark river. Under the cold, watchful eyes of their immortal masters, the human herds did more than just survive. They thrived. The vampires, in their absolute control, had eliminated war, famine, and pestilence. They provided security, however gilded the cage and the human population, freed from the pressures of its own destructive nature, began to swell. The carefully managed enclaves grew crowded, then spilled over, forming new settlements under the perpetual twilight of the vampire's reign. The world was at peace, a peace built on subjugation and sustained by blood. Lord Valerius, now more a distant god than a king, observed this growth from his crystalline spire. He felt a familiar, cold tremor in the earth, a sensation he had not felt since the world's fever broke. It was not the groaning of sickness, but the subtle, vigilant hum of the planet's immune system reawakening. The herds were no longer just herds. They were becoming a population. The infection was returning. The first sign was not an attack, but a change. A new generation of humans was born within the enclaves. Ones who had never known fear, who had never cowered before the night. They knew only the orderly harvest and the stories of a time when their kind ruled the world. A restless energy stirred in their blood, a spark of defiance that the vampire's controlled existence could not extinguish. They began to question the walls, to probe the boundaries of their world. They dug, not to escape, but to understand. And in their digging, they found things. Ancient, buried things. A shard of obsidian, twinned to the tear that had felled the werewolves, humming with latent power. Bones of long-dead Nexus walkers, pulsing with a faint, corrupting energy. The seeds of the old nightmares were still in the soil, waiting. Valerius watched, and he understood. The cycle was not a line with a beginning and an end. It was a wheel. The planet had used his kind as a cure, and now that the cure had allowed the disease to resurge, a new purge was inevitable. The immune system was preparing its next response. Perhaps it would be different this time, a new triad of horrors, or the resurrection of the old ones. The howl of the wolf was gone. But the silence it left behind was being filled by the murmurs of a species remembering its power. The end of days was not a single event, but a season, and the wind was shifting, carrying the scent of a new plague on the horizon. The nightmare was not over, it was only sleeping.